see folks joining here. Hi, everyone. My name is Fareed Mostofi. I work here at the Pulitzer Center. And as you start to join the webinar, go ahead and write into the chat your name, where you're based. We'd love to meet you all. I'm joined here by my colleague Hannah from the Pulitzer Center and our special guest, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Noel, the multimedia journalist who will be talking to you about my migration reporting in the Caribbean, and I'm really excited that you all are joining us today.
Awesome. Why don't we see if we can give a few more minutes for folks to join. Welcome, Jen from Albuquerque. We've got you from Milwaukee. Cool. So some different time zones here.
Most definitely.
Great. And why don't we'll give a few more moments, because I know we've got some more folks. Hey, Ben also from Milwaukee today. Cool, I'm curious. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where we have got a lot of wind and a little bit of sun. What's it look like where you are? Will you write that into the chat as well?
And I'm here in New York City, and we have had some of the best weather that I've seen in the last few months. So I'm really excited that it's sunny outside. And so that's been really nice lately. So really sunny in Milwaukee. That's really great. I'm really enjoying the warmth, especially because can't really go much of anywhere. So at least I have some sunshine in the backyard or, you know, on the front porch, things like that.
Exciting. Sounds like it's sunny in Milwaukee today. Good. Well, as folks are continuing to join us, I'm going to go ahead and let you all know what we have planned for the next about 50 minutes. And then hopefully we'll get us started right away with our guest speaker today. So we'll start by letting you know a little bit about the organization that's hosting this webinar, the Pulitzer Center. And then we're going to move into a presentation from Melissa Noel that will be much more than 5 minutes. That's a mistake there on the screen. We will plan on about 25 minutes with our guest, where we're just taking in some of the reporting, and then we'll move into Q&A. So wanted to quickly mention that we recognize that the entire world is navigating a pandemic that is resulting in a lot of newness for a lot of us. Throughout today, please take care of yourself. And also, if you are curious about how to introduce reporting about the coronavirus to your classroom, if you are just looking for digital resources for you, your family, your fellow students, your teachers, reach out to education@pulitzercenter.org, and we are here to listen and we are here to help in any way that we can. So we are in Zoom webinar today, which means that we have two ways for you to engage with our speaker. One is the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and that is where we're going to track questions throughout the presentation. Please keep adding your questions there. If they're technical questions, we'll respond right to you. If they're related to the topic, we might save them so that we can actually use your question during the Q&A portion. So add questions there. We also have a chat box that many of you are using right now to tell us where you're based. Please also use this throughout to respond to questions from Melissa. She'll be asking you a few, and also to respond to each other and connect so that we have an opportunity to meet. Notice that there are a few settings above where you're typing. What I see often happen is if it's only sent to the panelists, I'll see the responses, Hannah will, Melissa will, but the rest of you won't see each other's chat. So make sure it is set to all panelists and attendees. And a few agreements here, since we are going to be with people of all ages on this webinar, let's engage as if we're in a classroom, respectfully, and on topic so that we can all learn from each other. Please ask questions. This is a time to learn, and use the chat to help us continue to learn each other about this topic. So the last thing I'll say about the agreements today is we know that everybody's in a different situation right now. Please take care of yourself over the next hour. If you need to get up, move around, do what you need so that you can engage in the way that makes sense for you. I want to start before we talk about Pulitzer Center, which works on news. The place where I work works on news. I'm curious to know a little bit about how you are engaging with news. So let's start with a quick poll. I want to know, how often are you looking at the news? Is it several times a day right now, once a day, a few times per week, once a week, or just checking in every a few days or a few times over the course of the month? And use the chat box to tell us, what are the stories that you find yourself looking at right now? All right, I see responses coming in. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1, and let's take a look at how most of us are engaging. It looks like about half of us are looking at the news several times a day, most of us at least once. What stories are you all seeing in the news right now? Oh, here are the results. You can see them for yourselves. Add into the chat, what are the stories that you're seeing? Hey, hello, we've got guests from New York City. What about for you, Hannah? What are some of the stories you're seeing in the news quite a bit right now?
Definitely most of the news stories that I'm seeing are about the coronavirus right now, and you know, different angles on that news story, how it's affecting healthcare workers and other frontline workers, as well as how it's affecting people who are staying in their houses, science news about that. So a lot of different angles, but mostly on the same story.
I see Jennifer seeing stories about the economy. Melissa, what about you? What stories are you seeing mostly in the news?
Yeah, so as well as just like Hannah said, I'm definitely seeing stories about the coronavirus and reporting on them, but then also stories that maybe have come out of that. We're seeing how it is cutting across all lines. So it could be a sports story that talks about it. It could be fashion. We're talking a lot about graduation and travel right now and how those things have definitely changed. But what I've appreciated is not only seeing the bad news, right, or the negative news about it, but also seeing some of the great ideas and innovation that it has sparked from creatives everywhere.
Part of why I asked this question is because here at the Pulitzer Center, we are often responding to what are the stories that we're seeing a lot of in the news and what are some of the stories that might be missing. What we call stories that aren't getting enough attention in the news, underreported stories. And what we do at the Pulitzer Center is we make sure that journalists have the financial resources that they need, whether they're at a news outlet, on staff, or a freelance journalist working for multiple publications. We make sure that they have the funds to travel, to report on stories that are not getting enough attention. And because these stories are coming from journalists working for outlets all over the world on a variety of topics, what we've done is we've made sure that since these stories are published in over 100 news outlets a year, here are some of the outlets where those stories have been published. And also they're covering a lot of different issues. Here are some of the topics that our journalists have been reporting on. We make sure that these stories are able to not only get published in the outlets, but they're available on our website where you can find them for free without having a subscription to the publication. That's pulitzercenter.org. We also do outreach events like this so that these stories, even when they get published, that they can get the attention that they deserve and don't get ignored as a result of other pressing issues. So what we're going to be doing today is getting to really dive deep with Melissa, a grantee that we've been proud to work with, on an underreported story that she reported on for a few different publications, and that is definitely one that deserves to be told and that all of us could learn a lot from. As I turn the floor over to Melissa, what I ask you to do is to use the question feature to add questions you have for Melissa, and we'll address those during the Q&A. And please use the chat function to respond to what is connecting with you, what connections you see between what Melissa is sharing in your communities. And if you end up putting some questions there too, we will see them and we will make sure they get addressed during the Q&A. So without further ado, can you help me welcome our special guest, Melissa, with some virtual applause in the chat?
Thank you so much, Fareed. I really appreciate this. And I thank the Pulitzer Center for inviting me to be a part of this webinar today. I'm really excited to share a little bit more about this reporting project that, as you mentioned, was supported by the Pulitzer Center. And I just want to say, as someone who is a freelance journalist and working for multiple outlets, this was definitely, the support from the Pulitzer Center made it possible for me to go and report this story, because they're often really, they can take a lot of money. And as a freelancer, sometimes it's difficult to get to tell these underreported stories. So a place like the Pulitzer Center really helps make it possible. So and thank you for the applause in the chat, everyone. I'm trying to keep my eyes on the chat and speak with you all. So I appreciate you for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just start speaking with you about what I had the chance to work on and continue to work on, even right now as a reporter, for multiple publications. So this is the series I did for NBC News. It's called Love in a Barrel, Sharing Stories of Migration and Separation. I'm a reporter that focuses a lot of my work on underreported stories out of the Caribbean region, a region that typically is heavily covered when it has to do with natural disasters like hurricanes and those kinds of things, or crime, but not necessarily on other issues when it comes to mainstream news. And I wanted to really look into an issue that I had known about for years, but never really thought about some of the actualities that people may face within their own families if they're going through a migration situation. But first I'd like to start off on what my role is as a multimedia journalist. So as a multimedia journalist, I combine everything from text and images, sound and video to tell different kinds of stories. So what I love about my job is that today I could be on air for a television station, One Caribbean Television or their ABC or CBS affiliates. And the next day I am writing like 1,000-word feature story and taking photos for a digital publication like NBC News or HuffPost.com. And so I love the fact that I'm never doing the same thing twice, and that I get to show the different skills that I have, that I can shoot video, I can edit, I can take pictures, I can write both for broadcast, television, radio, and print. And it's always really interesting to see how things come together. And my project for the Pulitzer Center included all of that. So we had I had videos in it, graphics, charts, photos, everything. And so I love the fact that I get to do a little bit of everything as a multimedia journalist. So I hope you have some questions, or if you have any questions about kind of more specifics about what that entails, be sure to drop it in the chat, or you can save it for the Q&A. So I want to start off with, just a map of the Caribbean to just give you a sense of the region that I report on most often. So the reporting that I did for the Pulitzer Center mainly took place in Jamaica, which you see on the map. It's part of the Caribbean is separated into two regions, the Greater Antilles and the Lesser Antilles. And the Greater Antilles are some of your bigger islands like Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and what have you. And so I typically do stories pretty much around the region. But for this story in particular, I chose Jamaica because Jamaica is a country that has some of the highest migration rates in the entire world. And the amount of people who are migrating from there on a regular basis for different reasons, and then the amount of research that was actually done to not only understand, some of the reasons behind it, but also provide resources to families and for families, was why I thought Jamaica would be an ideal place to tell this story. So before we kind of get into what I focused on, we have a question for you, and that is, why do people migrate? Why is it that you think people might leave their home country and move somewhere totally different and leave everything else that they know behind? So Fareed is putting the poll up, and I want to give you all just a couple, like a minute or so to answer this question and tell me why you think that might be. Might they leave for work, to flee violence or persecution? For other family members who might live elsewhere, or to flee environmental challenges? Why do people migrate? And we'll give a few more seconds before we close the poll. Feel like it's Jeopardy a little bit. And okay, closing poll in 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, so 75% of people said that people migrate for work. 88% said to flee violence or persecution. And then we have for family or to flee environmental challenges. So I'd like to say that every single person that responded was correct, because, you know, every single situation is different, but people may migrate from their home country for all of those reasons, for one of those reasons. But what I'm going to talk about today, which is what a lot of people chose, is people migrating for greater economic opportunity. All of the people in this story series, Love in a Barrel, migrated for economic opportunities elsewhere. And most people migrated to the US or to Canada. So I'm glad that, you know, you participated in that poll. And now I kind of want to get into just a little bit about what is taking place, what had took place when I worked on this story. So the focus of this story series, Love in a Barrel, and that name was chosen, it was very specific and intentional, because I looked at barrel children. Now, who are barrel children? Barrel children are the children who are left behind in the care of relatives or friends when their parents migrate to other countries for work opportunities. And so they typically receive goods via shipping barrels, as well as money, maybe sent by Western Union or MoneyGram or some other kind of money service, but they often lack the emotional nurturance that a parent and child would typically have. And so this name actually was coined by a Jamaican sociologist, Dr. Claudette Crawford Brown, from the university in the University of the West Indies. And she coined this term to bring attention to the fact that migration was not necessarily the issue, because the Caribbean region is not the only region where people migrate. People migrate from all around the world for different reasons, as we just, saw in that poll. But what she wanted to bring attention to is that while a parent or parents may be migrating for economic opportunities, sometimes what happens is that their children can fall through the cracks if that communication isn't there, or if that emotional bond isn't there at the same level. And so that is what happens to some of these children. And so I focused the story series on these children. And what I did is I interviewed over 40 people. So everyone from the children who were left behind to people like Dr. Brown, who is a sociologist and was working with these children or had worked with them for decades, caregivers, the people who children are left behind with, as well as teachers and other people in the community that had some kind of stake or say in this. So moving right along, I wanted to give you 3 examples out of the people that I interviewed that really stuck out to me. So the first is Lejean Reed. When I met him, he was 15 years old, and what he said always stuck with me. He said, I remember when my dad migrated, when my baby brother was just born, and it really affected me in a way, because the only way that he can contact or see his dad is over the phone. Since his father left and migrated to Canada, I believe it was, he hadn't seen him in a number of years. And the only time he does get to interact is on the phone, or see his dad is maybe through, a video messaging platform. And so Lejean was a soccer star at his school. And he said to me, I appreciate the fact that my dad is, abroad and he's trying to provide a better life, but I want him here for my soccer games. He's missing out on, all the other kids have their parents there when it's time for report cards. It was that kind of thing. So although he could appreciate that his father sent him barrels because, he got new clothes and new shoes and different things that are typically sent in a barrel, what he didn't have was his dad's presence, and what he didn't have was his dad there to kind of, share in those special moments that you have when you're a teenager, especially. So that was one example. And Lejean ended up really being one of the main people in this story series, because he really stood out in terms of really showing that it wasn't just about the things, it was about the time, it was about the presence and the care. So the next person was Nacia Houghton. And she said, you know, from as long as she could remember, no one in her household had ever worked in Jamaica. They have been supported by people living abroad. So that person living abroad, the main person was her mother. Her mother left Jamaica when Nacia was about 3 years old. When I met Nacia, she was 26, and her mom had lived abroad in Canada for just about her entire life. But she said, you know, it's almost like you have to live with the reality that she always has to be away in order to provide all the things that you need, all of your necessities, right? But in Nacia's case, she was always very thankful that her mom was in constant communication and really tried to do things to let her know that she was there. So that was another one that really stuck out because, you know, as someone who, Lijan was 15, Nacia was older, you know, 26 at the time. So she was able to kind of put things into more perspective and understand. Before I move on, I wanted to know if there's any questions in the chat. I can't really see them at the moment with my screen share, but I want to know if there's anything so I could stop and answer it because I want this to be as interactive as possible.
So please jump in on the chat or in the Q&A if you have questions so far. We do have an attendee here, Ahilan, I hope I said your name correctly, who studied at the University of West Indies in the fall of 2014.
Awesome. I'm so glad that you could join us. And I was actually supposed to be heading to Jamaica next month, you know, pre-coronavirus, to present at a migration symposium that Dr. Brown was going to have. Of course, that's now postponed, but I'm definitely looking forward to getting back to UE. It was a great experience working with everyone there. So I'm so glad you could join us.
Awesome. Well, we'll continue to keep track.
Going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good. So, and the last person I'll bring up out of the people, you know, you would say, you know, the children, the people that experienced this or were left behind, Kellyanne Lindo, who is a really amazing artist that I was able to interview for this series. And I will never forget, you know, what she said about she understood the sacrifice her parents made. She definitely understood it. But she said, you know, it definitely changed the dynamic of her relationship with her mom. You know, she said the bond that her mother hopes that they would have, they don't have it. And, you know, that's because she had to kind of separate herself from that in order to keep from hurting. So this relationship, this closeness that her mother would want them to have, it's just not there. And I remember her saying, like, you know, I love my mom, I love my dad, I appreciate them and everything that they did for me. But this bond, this closeness just doesn't exist. And that's kind of like just the way it is. And so in meeting, and what I loved about Kellyanne is that she took this experience and expressed it in her art. Not to say that you know, she's definitely grateful, but she wanted to raise attention to how this impacts people's relationships. So one thing she did is she had this really great installation in Jamaica at I believe it was the National Art Gallery. And when I met her, she actually had a residency elsewhere in Kingston, and she presented the barrels. She suspended them in the air, and, you know, let's say it was 3 or 4. Now these barrels are shaped like cylinders. So when you put, you know, one and then the other, it creates like a big chain. And so when you suspend these in the air, or you put a little suspension and then you try to have 2 people communicate across that, what she was able to show is how difficult that is. And so it showed how difficult it is to communicate not only across distance, but when sometimes the love that is sent in a barrel can kind of almost feel like to a child that's replacing the time, the conversations, and the things that, you know, that really matter. And so it was really interesting to see how she brought that through in her art, and that really stuck out. And Kellyanne's story really resonated with a lot of people. So I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about how quote unquote, barrel children are impacted. And so what I found and saw in my reporting, interviewing people like Dr. Brown, interviewing psychologists, talking to teachers and caregivers, is that a lot of people that have gone through this experience, they have, sometimes it's depression, feelings of abandonment, feelings of loss, sadness. And also we saw with some children, they actually ran away. So I will give you the example that I was supposed to go interview the uncle of a child in, where was I in Jamaica? First I was in Steertown, Jamaica, and then I went to Monique, and I was supposed to interview the uncle of a 10-year-old boy that, was sent to live with him by his mother and, left behind, and he ran away. He literally ran away the day before, or the same day that we were heading there. And, to actually be there in that moment, not only as a reporter, but just, as a person, to see the terror in that, in his uncle's face, to know that he doesn't know where his nephew is. He has to call the mom and tell her. They did end up finding him, and he was okay. He had gone like 3 parishes away in Jamaica, about 2 hours, really far. But when they said to him, why did he do it? He was trying to get attention from his mom, who he hadn't spoken to for a couple of weeks. She didn't call and check in. And, to her credit, she was in New York working really hard, working 2 jobs, and she wanted to be able to send him, enough stuff for his birthday. But all he wanted was her to remember to call. So like, I saw that there were sometimes the parents were doing their very best. They were doing everything that they could to provide and to be there. But sometimes for the child, not understanding that, hey, that means that I may not be able to call you all the time. I may not be able to check in as regularly. It caused that miscommunication. So I thought it was really important to point that out, that these parents are making a great sacrifice for their children, for their entire families, to support them. But sometimes the communication does get lost. So I was really thankful to have, I would have mental health professionals with me when I would interview the children, especially because I wanted to be really sensitive to that. So, someone like Dr. Brown, she did sit in on many of the interviews, and I appreciated that, because she was able to intervene when necessary, because this is can be really traumatic for children and their families, especially if they were going through it at that point in time. So someone like Kellyanne had gone through the experience, but someone like Lijon was going through it at that exact point in time. So it was important for me to be sensitive, to be mindful. And then because I was interviewing a lot of children, to bring up things that we had in common, right? I never wanted to just start posing questions or, come off as if I only cared about my quotes. It was really important for me to get to know everyone I interviewed. So I kicked around a soccer ball with Lijon. We talked about reggae. I love reggae music. He loves reggae music. I talked about, being from Guyana. It was just really important to me that people understood that I was sharing these stories, not just to say, hey, look at this problem, look over here. It was to say, these are issues that people are facing in this community. Let's look at the issues. Let's look at on both ends, and let's look at who is working and trying to help and bring about change, because people are doing that. I think there's something that popped up in the Q&A. I'm not sure. I saw it come up for a quick second. So I'd like to answer that if I can. I can't see it.
Absolutely. The question here is, does the government provide mental health resources to the children who are far from their parents?
So that's a great question. So what I found, and I'll talk about the US and Jamaica. So in Jamaica, of course, there were some programs that people like Dr. Brown worked along with the Jamaican government to provide, for children and their parents, and then different groups, so psychologists and sociologists, as well as some educational and child welfare groups, did create programming so that there would be things like migration checklist for families so that you had a routine in place, or the child knew what was happening and he knew how things would change. But what I noted was that those things were very recent. And so these people were working to make that more of the standard versus, oh, you know, let me go and try to see what I can find. So these were recent programs that were being implemented due to the advocacy of many organizations in Jamaica to make it more of the norm that there will be resources for families. But I have to say that part of the reason why it might have been difficult for people to seek help or want to seek some kind of help was cultural stigma. A lot of times parents may not have talked about the fact that they were going to migrate for fear of, you know, things not working out, or them not actually being able to leave, or, you know, that kind of thing, or just the kind of cultural thing where you keep your business within your family. So I found that a lot. In the US, what I saw and what the reporting showed me is that while there are programs for families that were separated, let's say, you know, we took the polls, so families that were separated due to violence or fleeing persecution, so and they were seeking asylum or refugee status, there were specific programs for that. But for families that were separated because a parent may have said, I want to come and work as a nurse or a agricultural worker in the US, there weren't any. So what we tried to do with this series was to engage the community about how we could create stronger links between the Caribbean and the diaspora communities in the US, Canada, and UK, where you have really large, you know, Caribbean populations of people who've migrated and now, you know, call those places their homes. So great question, thank you. I'm gonna move on to talk to you a little bit about what the parents have said, right? I thought it was really important. So in part one of my series, I focused on the children. But in part two, I thought it was really important to hear from some of the parents. And so Errol Ray Sr. and his son, Errol Ray Jr. were a prime example of that. So Errol Ray Sr. migrated from Jamaica to the Bronx, New York when his son was just 2 days old. And he said, you know, he had to do it because he had to provide. But it was really hard. And what hurt him the most is that he realized that he was trying to provide financially, but his son really needed more than finance, right? He missed out on teaching him how to tie a tie, those father-son conversations. And he was only able to see his son about maybe 4 times throughout his life. He would call every day, he would check in, he would, you know, about the report cards, all of that good stuff, but he wasn't able to see him in person more than a handful of times until his son was actually 16 years old and he was able to come to the US and live with him permanently in the Bronx. And we'll get to why, you know, it took all that time a little later. I'll get to Claudette Higgins, who, what I appreciated about her is I thought it was important to show that parents also do go through depression, you know, separation anxiety. They have a really hard time. Can you imagine leaving everything you know behind to sacrifice for your children? You're in a new country, you may not know many people, you're working a couple of jobs, and you leave your children in the care of people that you hope and you trust will take care of them. So for someone like Claudette Higgins, she said that the hardest part for her was, you know, learning once her children, she has 5 children, learning that once they were adults, learning that they were verbally and physically abused by some of the people that she left her children in their care, trusting them, and they abused her children. And that was really difficult for her as a parent because she said, I did this for them, but I feel like I failed them at the same time. So she's been able to have really healthy conversations with her children about what happened during that time. And they say, you know, they were upset about what happened, but they never blamed their mother because they knew that she left to provide for them. So they're at a place now where she's still in the US. She works as a home health aide, right? She's a frontline worker. She's someone who is working right now through this pandemic. And her wish is to be able to bring her children here. And she started that process, several years ago, but it remains ongoing as to how and when she'd be able to get any of her children here. But what she does do is she goes home to Jamaica. She makes it a point to go every year and spend time with her children, as well as now her grandchildren. So I'm going to move on from that, because I want to know if you could put in the chat we talked about Nacia Houghton, we talked about, Claudette Higgins and Errol Ray Jr. and Sr. and Lejean. How do you think, if there's a story that you heard about throughout this, how do you think any of these stories, and just choose one and type in the chat, how do you think the story between Errol Ray Sr. and his father, how does that end up? He came his son actually moved to the US when he was 16. Claudette Higgins is trying to get her children to the US. What do you think, came of these stories, Nacia and her mom, of their relationships, or anything that you may be wondering after kind of hearing about these different stories? I'd just be curious to know, and then I'll tell you what actually took place.
So go ahead and add into the chat here. And if you don't remember exactly if you don't remember the person's name, you could describe the situation. Which story would you want to hear the ending of? Who's sticking with you? And as we're waiting here, we got a great question from Gwen, who I think knows where we're headed. And it's a question about, I'll go ahead and read it.
Mm-hmm.
When following these children throughout their lives, is it common for them to emigrate as they grow older? I'm wondering if there is a chain migration effect here.
That is a really good question. And so yes, the short answer to that is yes. There is typically chain migration that takes place in the general sense, but the reason why someone like Errol Ray Jr., only migrated to the United States when he was 16 is because of the length of time the process takes. So that migration process is definitely not an easy one, and not one that is quick at all. So just to put it into context, Errol Ray Sr. filed paperwork for his son when he was 6 years old the first time. The lawyer that they hired, as he relayed and as we outlined in the story, he said, did not do the paperwork correctly. So his son's application was denied. After he spent a couple thousands of dollars for the application forms, the visa fees, the lawyer's fees, those kinds of things. And so after that took place, he said he had to recoup the money. He worked as a plumber and a welder in the Bronx. He had to recoup that money. And he was also still sending money and barrels back home to his family. So he wasn't able to do that. And then he also just kind of felt scarred by the process. You go through that, it takes you all this time. And then when you feel like you're getting somewhere, it gets denied. To add to that, Errol Ray and anyone who comes to the United States, let's say from another country, most times when they do come, if they're coming to work, they're here on a particular work visa. So what that means is that you can come on this visa, you can stay in the country for a specified amount of time, and then you either have to go back or work to adjust your status. So while you're working to adjust your status in the US, that on average, that can take 2 to 3 years. And because you came on a visa that's a work visa, you're not in a position, and you cannot, based on immigration law in the US, you cannot then file for someone else. You have to wait until your status is adjusted. You have a different visa, you're under a different visa category, and then you are able to then apply for that child. But of course, by then, several years have passed. So for Errol Ray Sr., by the time he got the money up, everything was, fine again, had taken care of other things. He tried to get, and his son was 12. And it took from when his son Errol Ray Jr. was the age of 12 until just past his 16th birthday for not only all the paperwork, legal fees, appointments, and what have you, to actually go through fully. And when they did, reunite in the Bronx, he wants to, not only spend that time, but steer his son on the right path. He's seen a lot coming to the US, been through a lot. But for his son, he knows his dad in terms of, I know you've been there for me, but they didn't see eye to eye because he's a teenager, and this, his dad is telling him all these things to do, but they didn't really know each other. And they discovered that they needed they needed help. So they actually went to counseling their pastor, the pastor of their church, which is a largely Caribbean church in Brooklyn, who their pastor actually counseled them to help them understand the different issues that were taking place. And so that's one thing that, you know, even though federally there aren't programs for these families, we found that within communities, people were working in ways to help families that they knew had gone through this really difficult experience of being separated for so long. And then, you know, now, hey, we're in the same house. What do we do? That's kind of like what that was. So thank you for that question. Anything else before we move on? Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to share quickly how we were able to make some impact through this reporting, and why I'm really grateful to have had the support of the Pulitzer Center, because these things would not have been possible. So of course I created the the story series, but what we were able to do out of that is get another grant to create a community engagement series called Beyond the Barrel. And so what we did was we went into communities, largely Caribbean communities in New York and Atlanta, those kinds of places that have these large populations. And we had a film screening as well as a panel discussion with people who worked in the mental health space, as well as those who had gone through this experience, to not only share it, but then, you know, be able to provide resources for families, because there's not something at the federal level. And it was really successful. And Dr. Brown even, you know, came to the one in New York. She flew up from Jamaica. I'm really grateful to her for doing that. And we're able to not only provide insight, but resources. And we also brought in, you know, people who worked in the mental health space in New York, that had worked everywhere from, you know, different counseling services to the foster care system, where unfortunately some people did end up due to issues, but then they were able to help these families in a way that got them back in their homes and some more understanding. And what we were able to do also was go to the United Nations and present this as a case study for a World Social Justice Day, and, you know, talk to UN delegates and policymakers about why it's so important that you hear these stories, because they were actually about to go and vote on migration policy. And often, because this is such an underreported story, there were a lot of people who had never heard the term barrel child before that day, or had never really known about these issues. So I thought it was really great that we were invited to do that. There were updates made to these migration checklists that, you know, mental health professionals have been providing, and then a stronger regional and diaspora connections on migration issues, which was a really important point, because at the end of the day, you have, once a family, you know, a family member or families leave, they do need support in the place that they go, and then support, you know, for the children once they come, because there's culture shock, there's, you know, everything is really different. So we were able to create some linkages so that people could have that kind of support. And I thought it was really great. I want to bring up the fact that not every story is the same, right? Not all of these, you know, turn out in a bad way. What we wanted to present was the variation of stories. So I bring up Nacia Houghton, for example. Her and her mother had an amazing relationship, and she always said it was because her mom made it a point to stay in contact. She knew who her friends were, she knew what was happening in school. She was just, even though she wasn't physically present, she knew, like, she never felt like her mother was not there for her. And so providing counseling to the parents to understand that it's not just the material things that the children really want or desire, but it's also that connectivity, those connections. And I think that hearing stories like hers, you know, she finished university at the University of the West Indies. She has done really well. Her mom would love for her to come and live in Canada. And Nacia says she said to me, she has like a funny conflict, because one, she wants to stay with her grandparents in Jamaica, in Trelawney, where she's from, but she also wants to go and be with her mom. So she just finds it as like the funny, like, you know, thing she has to deal with now is saying, I don't want to choose one or the other. Let me kind of stay with you both, because you both have helped raise me. You all have gotten me to the point where I am now. And I'm really grateful for your sacrifices. And to make a point for her mom actually left Jamaica to work as a nurse, because she was actually able to make, I believe it was 3 times as much on the contract that she got in Canada, and then she was able to make there. And that's an example of sometimes in certain places, Jamaica as an example, but this happens all around the world, where there's an imbalance in the available jobs or the jobs for someone's skill level and, you know, what's available. And so that's why they make the decision to migrate. So in her mom's case, it was to be able to work as a nurse, earn the kind of money that would be able to take care of the family, put her daughter through college and do all those things that she wanted to do. And then now be able to say, you know, I'd like for you to come live with me there as well. So there were just a lot of different stories, and we wanted to make sure we weren't saying this is bad or this is good or this person is bad, but just to get people to understand how complex migration really is, the sacrifices that are made on both ends, you know, for all members of the family or families that go through this, and, you know, having a bit more understanding of it's not something where you can just fill out paperwork and then, you know, everything is all good and people are back together. It takes time, it's complicated, and we wanted to be able to not only present the issue, but ways that people are providing solutions. So I think that is the end for me. I think we do have another question.
We do, yes.
Yeah.
And the question that just came into the chat, first of all, thank you, Melissa. It's some continued applause. Hopefully we can send through the chat and through the airwaves to you. The question is, what is access to technology like in the Caribbean? Do children have access to platforms like Zoom and FaceTime?
Oh yeah, definitely. And so, yes, children have access to technology in these platforms, but I would say that depending on what part of the country you are in, country to country, it may not be at the same rate or at the same level as, you know, people might be in the capital or certain cities. So I would say that one thing that some of the students we saw kind of employ for kind of sharing their stories or interacting with other people is that they would use Skype to talk to students in New York or in Washington, D.C. And so the students could hear about, like, you know, what is life like there? And then students in the other place could tell or say that also. And then one of the big things, and I think a lot of people are really happy about this. I know I am. I talk to my cousins on WhatsApp pretty much every single day. So WhatsApp is really big, not only for video, not only for text messages, but for video chatting, voice notes, that kind of thing. So people were using WhatsApp a lot to be in contact with their parents. And so and what we found is that when people are able to like hear their parents' voice or see their face or get kind of like the updates, pictures, photos, that kind of thing, it really helped with the communication and with those feelings of, you know, they felt that closeness even though the distance was physically there.
Thank you. There were in the chat, many responded to your question about the stories that stuck out to them.
Okay.
If I could frame that in a question to you, what is the story that is sticking with you the most? And maybe for us, one of the outcomes that maybe would most surprise us or we could learn something from your perspective?
I think one of the things that has stuck with me for all this time, and I think will continue to stick with me as I report on this, is that just how much a parent would sacrifice in order to provide for their children. And just how, and even though you think a child may not understand, you know, give them the opportunity, give them the chance to be a part of the conversation and the discussion. And that you have some really powerful people doing really great things to be able to, you know, and I think that they should be applauded in that sense, but also understand that there can be some unintended consequences to some of these really brave or, you know, moves that are made with really great intent. But I think we also saw really great stories of triumph, of people's personalities, of people being innovative in these different things, and then also how now there are a lot of people who've gone through this experience that also want to help.
Let's look at two more questions before we wrap up today. Thank you for that. The next question is, Um, in what ways do you see children struggling to adjust to the US after leaving home? What did you hear about that experience?
Yeah, so some things that were pretty common were, getting made fun of for their accents, right? A Caribbean accent, and people in school saying you sound weird, that kind of thing. A lot of times the schools in the region have a lot of, how can I explain it? Like your classroom, you can walk right outside and you're outdoors. There's not necessarily brick buildings as there would be for a lot of schools in the US. So that could be is really different, right? Where you can go outside and there's like a garden or the field or the swing set is right there. And you're in high school here and it's a big, humongous brick building. That was really shocking for a lot of people. And then there were some children who, once they moved to the US, that's when they learned that their parent or parents had gotten married, or they had another sibling. So those things were really big for them. And then last thing would be, being at a particular level in school and excelling, and then coming to the US and being told that they had to repeat grades or things like that when they knew that they were at a standard already and should be able to move forward. So those were a lot. I heard that, over and over from many people.
We got another question come in, so we're going to sneak in two. I know I said two more, but we're going to sneak them in. Alexander's asking, are you planning to expand this research to other parts of the Antille, or in general, what are your next steps for your research?
Yeah, so this has really taken on a life of its own, and I'm so appreciative, because when I started this, I never thought that would be the case. But what I have done with it is I continue to do like the community engagement initiatives, which I think are really important, because this is something that is continuing to happen. So I've done things in in our Brooklyn, New York community. I'm connecting with folks in Atlanta and Toronto, Canada, that kind of thing. And I actually want to turn this into a longer series. Like, this was something for NBC, but I see, a documentary coming out of this, or just something a little bit more long form, because I continue to get stories and meet people. And this pandemic has kind of forced me to, push those things to the forefront and work on it.
Yes, to all of that. And a question just came in about what advice you would give to families who are struggling to build bonds with their children overseas, and what advice, and if I could add to that, what advice might you give to some of us who might be in this situation, or might know people, might not even know that it's their situation, but could be connecting with people who are in this situation? What advice would you give to us?
Yes, I would say, so the reason why I really got so interested in this story in the first place, and why it really stuck out to me, so as a Caribbean American, I've known these stories my entire life, but it was just so normal to me that I never thought about, I thought about the barrels and them being such a great thing, but I never thought about how for some people that could represent their parents' absence. And so what really got me interested in and looking into this more is the fact that talking about mental health impact around this is often considered taboo culturally. It's something people just don't talk about. And I said, we should talk about this. We should really talk about this. And instead of kind of complaining about us not talking about it, I said, I want to be the person that forces a conversation through, through reporting and do that. I would say that don't be afraid to, if for any families to get help, right? To seek counseling, because I saw from the people that I got to spend, I was working on this for about 6 months. So I got to spend a considerable amount of time with how much the counseling made a difference. And getting someone that understands those cultural nuances was really great for people, and knowing that it's okay to seek help and to talk about these things so that things can get better. It doesn't reflect badly on you. It's actually something good. And if this is something that you haven't, or you're not familiar with, just being a little bit more mindful and understanding that the migration process is complex. It's not simple. It's not easy. And so when I cover a lot of immigration stories, I often to make it a point to remind people, sometimes we hear that saying, people need to just get in line. But I can assure you that the line is not a straight one. It is difficult, and you don't just fill out paperwork and everything is okay. So to just, have some compassion for the people that, go through this difficult process, because it is one that I think for a lot of us, if the shoe was on the other foot, it'd be very difficult. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those tips. And we'll want to hear one final word from you before we close out. But before that, just wanted to let everyone on the webinar today know that we're going to, after we hear from Melissa, have a very short survey that I'll make sure stays within our time window here. And if you enjoyed the presentation today and you're curious about other underreported stories supported by the Pulitzer Center and the journalists who supported those stories, we have a few events coming up. First of all, if you want to connect Melissa with your classmates or with your students, you can actually reach out to the Pulitzer Center at education@pulitzercenter.org to request a visit for your class. Actually, any grantee, anyone who's received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on any of those topics you saw, any of those outlets you saw earlier, we could connect them with your class for free for a virtual visit. So please reach out and let us know. And also, if you want to tune into another scheduled webinar, we actually have one more left in this series that we've been calling speaking about underreported stories of resilience, looking at how communities have come through challenging experiences or navigated them. Our final one is going to be Wednesday, June 3rd. So in about 2 weeks, same time. And not only will we be having filmmaker Robert Takano to talk about his film about Tatenda Nguaru, who is from Zimbabwe, is now an activist in New York City, an intersex activist, but Tatenda will also be attending, so we'll be able to hear from both. And if you think of any other ways we can support you, you can connect with us at education@pulitzercenter.org. So we hope that you do. And with that, before we get to the survey, Melissa, anything else you want to share with us before we close out?
I just want to thank everyone for attending, for your engagement. Thank you so much for the comments. I'm seeing in the comments wishing, best of luck and that you found this really interesting. And I'm so glad, because sometimes, you're not sure how it may resonate with people, but I'm really excited to have the opportunity to do this work, and really, grateful to the Pulitzer Center for this. So I hope that, everyone is really taking this time to kind of find their underreported story in their life, whatever that might be, and bring that to the forefront, because I think that's where you definitely hold some power, for sure. So thank you all.
Thank you, Melissa. Another round of applause I'm seeing. Thanks, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Best of
This was
luck.
So great. And I really love doing these. So if you would like to get in touch for a Pulitzer Center session, I would love to do it.
Well, thank you all so much. And we look forward to staying in touch and continuing to have these conversations. As I close out the webinar today, you'll see a short survey. It should only take about 2 minutes. And also a quick note that we are a nonprofit and want to continue to support events like this. So please consider supporting the Pulitzer Center by spreading the word, by donating if you can, and by tuning into future events that we continue to offer for free. All right. Thank you so much. We look forward to staying in touch, and hope you have a great rest of the week. Thank you, Melissa.
Bye-bye.